Conrad Bellemare was 48 years old, owned a construction company worth just under $12 million, and had not been truly seen by another person in 4 years. Not unseen the way a man is when he walks into a room and people do not notice him. Unseen the way a man is when he sits across the dinner table from his own wife, the candles lit, the wine poured, the meal she made still warm in the serving dish, and realizes that the conversation happening between them is the kind two neighbors have across a fence. Polite, safe, about nothing that actually matters. He had built Bellemare Construction from a single pickup truck and a used nail gun he bought off a guy in Gatineau for $300. He was 22 years old then. He wore the same work boots 2 winters running because new ones were not in the budget. His father had died of a heart attack on a job site when Conrad was 19, and the grief of it had never fully left him. It had simply gone quiet, the way grief does when a young man decides that productivity is the only acceptable response to loss. By 48, his name was on buildings across the National Capital Region. He employed 63 people. He had a house in the glebe with a cedar deck he had built himself on a long weekend in 2019, the last time he had done something with his hands purely because he wanted. And he was profoundly, completely, invisibly lonely. Not the dramatic kind of loneliness, the quiet kind. The kind that arrives in small surrenders, his wife Sylvie going to bed at 9:30 without saying goodnight. The particular silence on Sunday mornings that used to be warm and had long since become simply empty. The way she answered his questions fully but never asked him anything back. He had convinced himself for years that this was just what a long marriage felt like. That the warmth went somewhere deeper, underground, still there even if neither of them was reaching for it anymore. He was wrong about that, but he would not understand how wrong for another few weeks. It was a Wednesday in late October when the accident happened. Conrad was driving back from a site visit in Canada, Highway 417, westbound, the sky that particular, flat gray that Ottawa does in autumn like nowhere else. A transport truck 2 lanes over clipped a concrete divider. The debris crossed 3 lanes in, under a second. Conrad swerved. The guardrail on the right side came up faster than he expected. He woke up in the Civic Hospital with a fractured wrist, a laceration above his left eyebrow that had required 11 stitches, and a mild concussion that the attending physician, Dr. Anita Sharma, described as significant enough to monitor, but not dangerous. He lay in the hospital bed that first evening, watching the ceiling tiles and listening to the particular sound of a hospital at night. The soft footsteps, the distant beeping, the muffled conversations in the hallway, and something shifted in him that he could not yet name. Dr. Anita Sharma had known Conrad since they had both served on the board of a community housing initiative 3 years earlier. She was direct and careful and had a way of listening that made people say more than they intended. She came in around 9 that night, checked his chart, sat down in the chair beside the bed. "Vitals are steady," she said. "You are going to be fine, Conrad." He stared at the window, the Ottawa skyline gray and orange in the October dark. "Anita," he said, "I need to ask you something unusual." She waited. "I want to let people believe the concussion is worse than it is, that I have lost my memory, that I do not recognize anyone." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, medically, a voluntary cognitive assessment is within normal parameters. You are fully alert." "Oh, Kurt, but why?" He looked at her. "Because I do not know who is in my life because they love me, and who is there because of the company." He paused. "And I need to know. I have been building things for other people for 26 years. I do not know if a single one of them would show up for me if there was nothing left to build." Dr. Sharma pressed her lips together. "What you find may not be what you hope for." "I know," he said. "That is why I need to find it." She agreed. And just like that, on a Wednesday night in room 319 of the Civic Hospital, Conrad Bellemare disappeared. The man everyone needed stayed. The man who needed something stayed quiet and waited to see who would come looking. What Conrad was doing has a name in psychology. It is called a relational audit, the deliberate removal of power and status from a relationship in order to observe what remains underneath. In its absence, the people around him would no longer be performing for the benefit of an employer, a patriarch, a source of financial stability. They would simply be themselves. And sometimes, that is the most frightening thing a person can reveal. The first lesson of Conrad's story is one that rarely gets discussed in honest company. Financial success inside a family does not protect against emotional abandonment. It accelerates it. When a person becomes the primary provider, they are slowly redefined by that role in the minds of everyone around them. They stop being a person with needs and become a function, a resource. And the quiet loneliness that follows is made worse by the fact that, from the outside, everything looks fine. Word reached his brother Luke by phone before the night was out. Luke was 44, had never held a position longer than 2 years, and supplemented his income with a series of side ventures, an e-commerce store that had never turned a profit, a franchise inquiry that had never materialized, a consulting arrangement with Bellemare Construction, for which Conrad had been paying him a monthly retainer since 2020, in an arrangement that had always felt less like business and more like obligation. Luke arrived the next morning with a coffee from the good place on Elgin Street and the particular energy of a man who has already run several calculations before entering the room. "Big brother," he said. "It is Luke, you remember me?" Conrad stared at him. Blank. Steady. Luke set the coffee down, pulled up a chair, and opened his phone. He had already drafted a message to the company's operations manager, CCing himself, describing a temporary transition of oversight responsibilities pending Conrad's recovery. He showed it to Conrad without explanation, as though showing a man a document he had already agreed to sign in some conversation that had not yet taken place. "Someone has to hold things together," Luke said. "The guys on site need leadership. The clients need reassurance. I can step in until you are back on your feet." Conrad said nothing. His eyes stayed unfocused. Luke posted something to Facebook before he left the room. A photograph taken through the doorway, Conrad in the bed, wrist-wrapped, stitches visible, with a caption about family pulling together in difficult times. 22 people shared it within the hour. What Luke demonstrated in that room is what psychologists call proxy entitlement. The belief that proximity to another person's achievement constitutes a partial ownership of it. He had watched his brother build something for 26 years without contributing meaningfully to its construction. But he had been present for enough dinners and Christmas mornings that the company had begun to feel, in some internal ledger he carried privately, like a shared asset. Crisis simply created the opportunity to formalize what he had always considered a reasonable claim. Raymond Cloutier arrived 40 minutes later. He and Conrad had been friends since their teenage years in Hull, had played on the same hockey team, had stood in each other's wedding parties. Raymond ran a mid-size property management firm and dressed like a man who spent more money on clothes than he would ever admit. He gripped Conrad's hand with both of his, eyes appropriately red around the edges. "Brother," he said, "whatever you need, I am right here." Then he leaned forward and lowered his voice. "Listen, you have assets that need protection right now. Before the lawyers get involved, before anyone starts asking questions about the corporate structure, let me move some things into a holding entity I have set up. Clean, above board, nobody's business but yours." He slid a business card across the blanket. Someone in private wealth management. Someone who owed Raymond a favor, though he did not say that last part. Conrad stared at the ceiling. Raymond straightened up, squeezed his hand once more, and left the card on the blanket. 35 years of friendship. And in the end, what it had produced was a man sitting in a hospital room beside someone who could not speak, talking about asset protection. What Raymond illustrated is a pattern researchers call instrumental relationship drift. A friendship that began in genuine affection, built over decades of shared history, had gradually become transactional as the financial gap between them widened. Raymond did not arrive to extract something from a stranger. He arrived to extract something from a man he genuinely believed he was helping. That is the more dangerous version. The relationships that do the most damage are rarely the ones that were never real. They are the ones that were real once and changed so slowly that nobody noticed when they stopped being what they used to be. Conrad's son Philippe was 23, studying engineering at the University of Ottawa, and arrived mid-morning still wearing his backpack from the bus. He crossed the room without pausing and wrapped both arms around his father's shoulders. He did not say anything. He did not need to. He just stayed there for a long moment, one hand at the back of Conrad's neck, the way Conrad used to hold him when he was small, and the sound he made was not quite a cry and not quite a breath. It was something more specific than either of those things. "Dad," he said finally, "I do not care about any of it. Just come back." Luke stepped forward from the corner and put a hand on Philippe's shoulder. "Your father would want you to think about the family's responsibilities right now. You are almost graduated. You could step into a leadership role at the company temporarily. That is what a man does." Philippe looked uncertain. He glanced toward the bed. He did not step away from his father. What Luke attempted in that moment is called parentification through crisis. The drafting of a young person into adult roles using their love for a parent as the mechanism of recruitment. It is a particular kind of manipulation because it does not target greed or ambition. It targets devotion. And, if it takes root in a young person at the right moment, it can reshape their relationship to responsibility and self-worth. For years, Conrad's mother Georgette sat in the corner chair and said almost nothing. She was 71 years old, had raised 2 boys alone after her husband died, and had long since developed the quiet, patient attention of a woman who has watched people long enough to see through what they do to what they mean by it. She watched Luke. She watched Raymond. She noted the business cards still sitting on the blanket. And then the door opened, and Sylvie walked in. Sylvie Bellemare was wearing the old navy fleece she had owned since before they were married, the one with a small burn mark near the left cuff from a camping trip in Algonquin in 2007. Her hair was not done. Her eyes were swollen. She was not apologizing for either of those things. She sat in the chair beside the bed and took Conrad's hand. She did not mention the company. She did not glance at the business card on the blanket or ask anyone in the room what had been discussed. She looked at her husband. "My name is Sylvie," she said quietly. "We met at a Christmas party in Gatineau in 2003. You spilled red wine on my white coat and spent the next 40 minutes trying to get the stain out with club soda and paper towels." A small breath of a laugh. "It did not work. I kept the coat anyway." She told him about the first apartment they had shared, a 2-bedroom on St. Patrick's Street, with a radiator that knocked every night at 3 in the morning, and which they had eventually named Gerald. She told him about the August weekend they had driven to Prince Edward Island with no reservations and ended up sleeping in the car in a campground parking lot because every inn on the island was full, and how they had laughed about it so hard the car shook. She told him about the scholarship fund he had quietly set up for apprenticeship training in Gatineau, the one he had never mentioned publicly, the one funded through a numbered company so his name would not appear anywhere. For 3 days, she came back every morning. She brought photographs in a small album. She described each one the way a person describes something they are afraid of losing. Slowly, with attention to every detail, she wiped his forehead when the fever from the laceration rose on the second night. She hummed something low and familiar while he lay still. She brought his mother tea from the cafeteria without being asked. On the second night, believing he was asleep, she said something in the dark room that Conrad would carry with him for the rest of his life. "I stopped reaching for you," she whispered. "Somewhere around 2021 I stopped trying to get through, and I told myself it was because you were too busy. But the truth is I was afraid. afraid that if I kept reaching and you kept not noticing, I would have to admit that something had broken that I did not know how to fix. So I went quiet instead, and I let the distance grow. And that is on me, Conrad. That is as much my fault as anything else. He did not move, but something in him that had been held very tightly for a very long time released. What Sylvie was doing during those 3 days is called secure-based behavior in attachment theory, the offering of care and presence with no guarantee of reciprocation, no certainty of return. She did not know if any of her words were reaching him. She kept speaking anyway. That anyway is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the whole thing. Love under uncertainty. Love that continues even when the evidence for its return has become unclear, is the only kind that means anything when it counts. What Conrad did not know yet was that Sylvie had been carrying something for years that no one in that room, not even Georgette, was aware of. On the third morning, Sylvie left the hospital just after 6 o'clock, before the hallway had filled up with the day's visitors. The nurse on the early shift saw her go, head down, moving quickly through the lobby against the cold October air. She came back 2 hours later with nothing in her hands. That afternoon, Dr. Sharma came in during a quiet window and sat down. "I need to show you something," she said. She opened her phone to a document from the hospital billing office. Sylvie had paid the outstanding medical account in full, not with a credit card, not from the joint account. In cash, from the private sale of a piece of jewelry brought in to an estate buyer on Bank Street. Her grandmother's sapphire brooch, a piece that had come from Montreal, passed down through 3 generations, the only thing of her grandmother's that Sylvie had kept. The thing she had told Conrad on a quiet evening years ago that she would someday leave to a daughter if they ever had one. Sold, that morning, without a word. Conrad read the receipt twice. He folded it and held it in his palm without speaking. When Sylvie came back that evening, she sat in her chair, took his hand, and opened the album to the page where she had left off. Her hands were steady. She did not look at her left side where the brooch was not pinned to her collar. She did not mention it. She simply turned the page and kept going, her voice unhurried, as though she had all the time in the world and had already made peace with spending it exactly here. What Sylvie's act represents is what researchers call an unilateral sacrifice, the giving of something irreplaceable with no expectation of acknowledgement. The brooch was not an asset. It was an inheritance in the truest sense, the physical continuation of a woman she had loved who was no longer living. She sold it quietly, so the man in that hospital bed would not carry it as a debt. That choice, to absorb a loss rather than let someone you love feel its weight, is not a small kindness. It is one of the rarest forms of love there is. It was late on the third night that Conrad heard something that nearly broke his composure entirely. The hallway outside room 319 had gone quiet. Georgette was asleep in the corner chair. Philippe had gone home at midnight. The monitors beeped steadily in the dark. Conrad lay still. Then he heard Luke's voice just outside the door, low, measured, the voice of a man who believes he is not being overheard. "She wanted out 2 years ago," Luke was saying. "Had a lawyer draw up separation papers. She never filed them." Raymond's voice came back, quieter. "So why didn't she?" A pause. "No idea. But here is the thing. If she files now, while he has no memory, Quebec family law applies. The company assets go into partition. We make our move during the transition period, before the estate is restructured." A short silence. "The timing on this," Luke said, "is almost too good." The elevator at the end of the hall hummed. A door somewhere closed. Conrad lay completely still in the dark for a long time. He had not known about the separation papers. Not a word, not a suggestion. He went back through the years with the careful attention of a man who now understood he had been reading the wrong things. He thought about 2022, a specific Sunday morning in November, when he had come downstairs and found Sylvie at the kitchen table at 6 in the morning. Cup of coffee in front of her, gone cold. Staring at nothing, not crying, just sitting in the dark kitchen in complete stillness, the way a person sits when they have been there a long time and stopped expecting anything to change. He had kissed the top of her head. He had walked directly to his office for a call with a developer in Sudbury. He had not asked her what was wrong. He had not asked her what she was thinking about, or how she had slept, or whether she needed anything. He had assumed she was tired. He had assumed she would be fine. He had been so consumed with the next project, the next phase, the next proof that a kid from Hull with a used nail gun had made something real, that he had not noticed his wife sitting alone in the dark at 6 in the morning with a cold cup of coffee and a silence that had been growing between them for 3 years. He thought about that cold cup of coffee for a very long time. What Conrad was experiencing in that moment is called attribution reversal, the point at which a person's fear, which they have been directing outward at others, turns inward and begins to examine their own record honestly. It is one of the least comfortable psychological experiences available to a human being, and one of the most necessary. The loneliness Conrad felt in his marriage did not arrive because Sylvie stopped caring. It arrived because he became so defined by achievement that he lost the habit of presence. And Sylvie, unwilling to compete with something as consuming as a business built on 26 years of sacrifice, eventually stopped reaching. What psychologists call quiet quitting in love does not look dramatic. It looks like early bedtimes and answers to questions and the careful absence of anything that might start a real conversation. The partner does not leave. They are right there every day, but they have quietly stopped expecting anything to be different. Sylvie had drafted those papers not because she stopped loving Conrad, but because she had been standing alone inside a marriage for 2 years and could no longer clearly see the path back to him. She had torn them up because she still believed, somewhere underneath the distance and the silence, that the man she had chosen was still in there. That is not weakness. That is one of the hardest acts of quiet courage a person can choose. The next morning, Sylvie arrived earlier than usual. She brought a small container of tourtière from a recipe that had belonged to her grandmother, the same grandmother whose brooch was now in a display case on Bank Street. She set it on the bedside table and pulled her chair close and opened the album near the back. "This is from our 10th anniversary," she said. She tilted the page toward him. "We took the train to Quebec City. You insisted on finding the restaurant your father used to take your mother to before you were born. We walked up and down the hot ville for 2 hours in the rain, and when we finally found it, it had closed 3 years earlier and was a wine bar." A quiet laugh. "We had the best meal of our lives in the wine bar instead." She looked at him with clear, steady eyes. "I know you may not remember any of this," she said, "but I am going to keep telling you anyway, because even if you never remember who we were, I want you to know the kind of man you are, the kind worth remembering." Conrad's hands, lying flat on the blanket, had curled loosely into fists, not from anger, from the effort of not reaching for her. He pressed his phone quietly beneath the blanket and sent a message to Dr. Sharma. "Keep Luke and Raymond away from Sylvie. Do not let them get her alone. Something bigger is coming." Her reply, "Already on it. Conrad, what I found in your financial records this afternoon goes deeper than you realize. Be prepared." He set the phone down. Outside the window, Ottawa moved through its Thursday, the canal path along the Rideau. A cyclist in a yellow jacket crossing the Pretoria Bridge, the city that had made him and nearly swallowed him, going about its morning as though nothing particular was happening on the 3rd floor of the Civic Hospital. He was almost ready, but not quite, because somewhere ahead there was still something he had not yet heard, something that would not simply change the way he saw the people around him. It would change the way he saw every year of his life going backward. Dr. Sharma had a habit, when she was carrying news that would hurt, of pausing at the door before she came in. Just a second, her hand on the frame, as though giving herself one last moment to be certain. She paused at the door that evening. She sat down. She crossed her hands. "I went back through a few years of corporate filings," she said. The same documents your accountant pulled for the insurance review. She held his gaze. In 2021, Bellemare Construction came within 60 days of defaulting on a line of credit that would have triggered a creditor review. You know that. What I do not believe you know is how the shortfall was resolved. Conrad was still. Your wife made 3 private wire transfers through a family law attorney, Dr. Sharma said, structured to appear as a deferred shareholder contribution from a numbered company, untraceable back to her unless you knew where to look. She paused. $112,000, her inheritance from her mother's estate. The money she had been holding since 2019, the year her mother died. The monitor beeped softly. She saved your company, Dr. Sharma said, and she structured the transfers so you would never know it was her. Conrad did not speak. He thought about 2021, the months of working until 2 in the morning, the dinners where he had barely been present, mind still on the numbers, on the subcontractors, on the bank. He had attributed the tension in the house to his own stress. He had assumed Sylvie was keeping her distance because he was difficult to be around during that season. He had never once considered that she might have been sitting with a knowledge of his company's finances that she had carried entirely alone, that she had watched him nearly lose everything, and had quietly stepped between him and the fall without ever telling him she had done it. He thought about her mother's inheritance. Sylvie had told him once, simply and without sentiment, that she wanted to use it someday to open a small literacy program for francophone children in Vanier. The particular way her face looked when she said it, not wistful, just certain, the face of a person describing something they have already decided. Gone. Quietly. For him. Without a single word. What Sylvie had done in 2021 is what researchers call a silent load-bearing act. A sacrifice so significant and so carefully concealed that it restructures the foundation of a relationship without either person fully understanding what has shifted between them. She did not tell Conrad because she understood something about him he had not yet understood about himself. He would have received it as a debt. He would have carried it the way he carried everything, alone, quietly, with the particular weight of a man who was raised to believe that needing help was something to be managed rather than acknowledged. She protected him from his own sense of obligation. That is what psychologists call empathic attunement. Understanding not just what someone needs, but what they are not yet ready to receive. That same evening, Dr. Sharma received a message from the concierge at a hotel on Spark Street, where Luke had apparently arranged a private meeting. He had asked Sylvie to come. Conrad was sitting up before she finished reading the message aloud. She held up a hand. I have the security footage from the lobby. Watch first. She handed him her tablet. The footage showed a small meeting room off the main corridor. Luke was standing at the end of a table, Raymond beside him, 2 phones and a folder of documents laid out between them. Sylvie stood on the other side. She had come alone. Luke was talking. His posture was the particular posture of a man who has rehearsed what he is about to say and believes it is reasonable. He slid the folder across the table. Raymond nodded alongside him. Then Luke said something that made Sylvie take a single step back, her hand coming up slowly to her collarbone. Conrad turned up the audio. Luke's voice came through quiet and flat. I cut the brake line on the passenger side. Not enough to fail on the highway, just enough to compromise it in a hard swerve. I needed a window. I did not intend for him to be seriously hurt, but with his memory gone, the timing is ideal. You sign these papers, we move the assets into the holding entity before the courts get involved, and you walk away with your half before anyone can dispute anything. Nobody loses. The room on the screen went completely still. Then Sylvie spoke. Her voice was low, it was not shaking. You tampered with his vehicle. Luke opened his mouth. You are his brother, she said. His blood. You sat at our table at Christmas. You held his hand at your mother's hospital bed in 2018, and you deliberately put him in a position to die on a highway. She pushed the folder back across the table without opening it. "I know exactly what you believe about me," she said. "You think I am exhausted and invisible and one signature away from walking out. You have been counting on that for 2 years." She looked at him directly. "But I want you to hear me very clearly, Luke. I would sleep on the floor of that hospital room for the rest of my life before I let you take one thing Conrad built from nothing." Her voice did not break, not once. "Everything he has, he earned from Gatineau, from a used nail gun and a pickup truck and 26 years of showing up before dawn and staying until after dark. He did not inherit it. He did not luck into it. He sacrificed for it, and I sacrificed alongside him. Neither of us did any of that so you could walk in here with a folder and walk out with what was never yours." Raymond pushed off the wall. "Sylvie, be reasonable." "I am being the most reasonable I have ever been in my life," she said quietly. She reached into her coat pocket and set her phone on the table. A voice recording application timer. The color left Luke's face. Raymond went very still. Sylvie picked up her coat. "You have 1 hour to remove yourselves from anything connected to Conrad Bellemare. After that, I call Staff Sergeant Fournier at Ottawa Police and I hand this recording to her, personally." She moved to the door. "And Luke," she said, pausing her hand on the frame. "Whatever you believe this family owed you, it was never real. Not a cent of it was ever yours. It never will be." She walked out. In room 319, Conrad sat on the edge of the hospital bed with the tablet in both hands and tears running quietly down his face. He had set this entire thing in motion because he was afraid. Afraid that he had become a function rather than a person. Afraid that the life he had built had made him interchangeable. And what he had been watching, building its evidence slowly over 5 days, was not the confirmation of his worst fear. It was the complete dismantling of it. While he had been watching from behind closed eyes, his wife had been between him and everything that wanted to take apart what they had built. While he tested her, she had protected him. While he lay still and waited to see who loved him, she had already answered that question in every possible way a person can. With money, with time, with presence, with courage, with a voice that did not shake in a hotel meeting room at 10 o'clock at night. He reached for his phone and called Dr. Sharma. "Anita," he said. His voice was steady. "Tomorrow morning. It is time to remember. What happens when a person finally steps out of the role they have been performing? When they drop the silence and the distance and the carefully maintained composure and simply say the true thing is one of the most disorienting and necessary experiences in a long relationship. It does not feel like relief immediately. It feels like exposure, like standing in a room with all the windows open at once. The morning of the 5th day, room 319, was the fullest it had been all week. Word had spread, the way word spreads through the networks of people who have attached their futures to another person's fortune, that the estate lawyer was arriving at 10 o'clock to discuss the company's interim governance. By 9:30, the room had filled with faces Conrad recognized at varying distances of relationship. 2 cousins from his father's side who had not called him in 3 years. A former business partner whose contract had not been renewed in 2022, Luke in a freshly pressed shirt, Raymond near the window with 2 coffees from the place on Elgin. Philippe stood with his arms crossed, back against the wall, jaw set, looking at his father with the expression of a young man who has been told too many things by too many adults over the last 5 days and can no longer be certain which version of events is true. Georgette sat in her corner chair. Her hands were folded. She was not looking at anyone in particular. She was watching everything. Sylvie came in at 9:55. She had slept, or tried to. There were shadows under her eyes and a stillness about her. Not the stillness of a woman who was uncertain, but the stillness of a woman who had made a decision and was carrying it with complete steadiness. She sat in her chair. She took Conrad's hand the way she always did. She did not look at Luke. Conrad sat up. Not the slow, uncertain movement of a man emerging from fog. the deliberate, fully alert movement of a man who has been watching and listening and is now completely clear. He looked around the room. He took each face in, without hurry, the cousins, the former partner, Raymond, Luke, Philippe by the wall. Then he looked at his wife. "Sylvie," he said, quiet and direct, "I remember everything." The room went absolutely still. Raymond set his coffee down on the windowsill. Luke's posture shifted. One of the cousins made a sound. Philippe straightened up from the wall. "I remember who I am," Conrad said. "I remember what we built, and I remember every single person standing in this room." Sylvie's free hand had come up over her mouth. Her eyes were wide and full of something that was not quite surprise, more like the face of a person who had been hoping for something for a long time, and was only now allowing themselves to believe it might actually be happening. "Sylvie," he said. He held her gaze in the way he had not done in 4 years. "I was wrong. I built walls inside our own house, and I called it focus, and I called it commitment, and I told myself I was doing it for our family. But I was doing it because I did not know how to be still. Because if stopped building, I was just a kid from Hull with dead father and a grief I had never finished carrying." His voice broke slightly on those words. He let it break. "I let you be lonely inside our own marriage. I walked past you in the dark at 6 in the morning and did not ask you a single question. That is on me. That is not something I can explain away." Sylvie was crying. She had stopped trying not to. "I drafted separation papers," she said. She did not say it quietly. She said it to the room, directly, with no softening. 2 years ago, I was heartbroken. I felt like I had been standing beside a man who could no longer see me. I had the papers drawn up and I signed them." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "And then I tore them up. Because I knew that somewhere under all of it, the man I chose was still there. I just did not know how to reach him anymore." "You reached me," Conrad said. "Every morning this week. Every photograph. Every memory." He paused. "I know about the brooch." She shook her head slightly. "I know about your mother's inheritance," he said. "The $112,000. I know what you did in 2021. And I know you structured it the way you did so I would never feel like I owed you." The room had gone so quiet that the ventilation system above the ceiling tiles was clearly audible. Sylvie held his gaze for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft and entirely certain. "You would have carried it like a debt," she said. "And you already carry too much alone." What was happening between Conrad and Sylvie in that moment is what couples therapists call a rupture and repair sequence, one of the most psychologically significant events that can occur within a long-term relationship. Research is consistent on this point. It is not the absence of conflict or disconnection that determines the health of a partnership. It is the willingness of both people to name what went wrong, take honest ownership of their part in it, and move toward each other rather than away. Conrad was not simply apologizing. He was identifying, without deflection, the specific behaviors that had produced the distance between them. And Sylvie was not simply forgiving. She was being radically honest about her own pain, the silence, the papers, the years of reaching without response while simultaneously choosing to release it. That is what healing looks like from the outside. It is not clean. It is not immediate. But this moment, this mutual, uncalculated honesty, is where it begins. Then Conrad turned to the rest of the room. He picked up his phone. He pressed play. Luke's voice filled the room, flat, unmistakable. "I cut the brake line on the passenger side. Not enough to fail on the highway, just enough to compromise it in a hard swerve. I needed a window." Luke moved through several expressions in rapid succession, none of them composed. Raymond set his coffee down very carefully and took a single measured step toward the door. Georgette stood up from her corner chair. She crossed the room with the unhurried authority of a woman who has earned every step she takes. She looked at Conrad in his hospital bed, her oldest boy from Hull, who had cried alone in a parking lot and built something real from nothing. She looked at Sylvie beside him, her hand still in his. Something moved across Georgette's face that was equal parts grief and pride, and 71 years of knowing exactly what love costs when it is real. Then she turned to face her younger son. "Get out of this room," she said. "Not loudly, not with theatrics. Get out. And if your name comes near anything belonging to Conrad again, I will call the police myself, and I will not lose a moment of sleep over it." Luke left without speaking. Raymond followed. The two cousins found prior commitments. The former business partner excused himself into the hallway. Philippe crossed the room and put his arms around both his parents at once. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Georgette sat back down in her chair. She straightened her back. She said to nobody in particular, "Now, that is a family." 3 months have a way of clarifying what matters and what was only ever noise. January came to Ottawa the way it usually does, hard and clear and indifferent. The kind of cold that makes the city honest. The Rideau Canal was frozen by the second week. The light off the ice in the mornings was the particular blue-white that Ottawa people know and do not always appreciate until they have lived somewhere without it. Conrad and Sylvie went to counseling twice a week, first individually and then together, with a therapist whose office on Somerset Street had a small succulent garden on the windowsill and the kind of careful, unhurried presence that made it possible to say the true things without first having to build up to them. They learned, imperfectly and slowly, to say what they had spent years not saying. He learned that silence is not the same thing as strength. She learned that staying is not the same thing as being present. Both of them learned that a marriage does not come apart all at once. It comes apart in the small, daily choices to say nothing, ask nothing, reach for nothing. And it heals the same way, one honest moment at a time. Sylvie launched a literacy program for Francophone children in Vanier in February, funded through a small foundation Conrad established in her mother's name. She called it the Marguerite Beaupré Reading Circle, after the woman whose inheritance had quietly saved a company, asked for no acknowledgement, and passed a brooch down through 3 generations with the particular faith of someone who believed the people coming after her would know what to do with what they were given. Philippe graduated in the spring and joined Bellemare Construction not because anyone pressured him into it, but because he asked to. He started on a site crew in May, showed up before anyone else, and did not mention whose name was on the company for the first 3 months. The crew liked him for it. Conrad restructured the company. Every position that had been created as a favor, rather than earned, was eliminated with notice and severance and the particular directness of a man who has finished apologizing for things that were never owed. He created a community reinvestment fund in Gatineau and hired 3 young tradespeople from the same streets where he had grown up to run it. He stopped taking early morning calls from developers in other provinces. He started coming home for dinner before Philippe and Sylvie had already cleared the table. Some evenings after Philippe had gone back to his apartment, Conrad and Sylvie sat on the cedar deck he had built in 2019, the last time he had done something with his hands for no reason other than wanting to. The patio light flickered in the cold when the wind came up from the canal. He had never fixed it. Somehow that felt right now, a small imperfection in something he had built himself, familiar enough to belong to them. In early March, at the Gatineau church where they had been married, in the same hall where Sylvie had once sat alone in a back pew and asked for something she was not sure was still possible, they renewed their vows. The hall was full. Sylvie's sister had driven up from Montreal. A dozen people from the construction crews came in their good jackets and sat in the middle rows. Georgette was in the front in a burgundy dress she had bought 2 weeks earlier and ironed herself the night before, because some occasions require preparation that begins with ironing. Conrad stood at the front in a dark charcoal suit, no tie, top button open, the way Sylvie had always told him she preferred. When she came down the aisle in a simple ivory dress, the kind of dress that is beautiful without announcing itself, He did what he had been trained his whole life not to do in front of other people. He let himself cry, quietly, without looking away from her. He went to one knee. He held up a ring. It was her grandmother's sapphire brooch, remounted. The stone set into a new ring by a jeweler on Spark Street, same street where it had been sold, redeemed by Conrad the same afternoon Dr. Sharma had shown him the billing receipt. Before Sylvie had ever known he was aware of what she had done. "I have been a man with a company and a man without one," he said. His voice carried through the hall the way a voice carries when someone is finally saying exactly the right thing. "And the only time I was ever truly building something that mattered was when I remembered who was standing beside me while I did it." He looked up at her. "You are not just my wife, you are the foundation. You were there when I had nothing. You stayed when I had everything and forgot to see you. I see you now. I promise you, I see you now." She held out her hand. It was trembling. He placed the ring on her finger. The hall responded the way a room responds when something true and hard-won is happening right in front of everyone, fully, without reservation, without any of the careful distance that people normally maintain between themselves and someone else's emotion. Georgette pressed her handkerchief to her face. Then she folded her hands, straightened her back, and said quietly to herself, "Now that is family." Conrad and Sylvie stood together at the front of the hall, her head against his shoulder, his arm around her. The light through the high windows falling across the old wooden floor the way late winter light does in Quebec, thin and gold, and full of the particular promise of something not yet arrived, but genuinely on its way. His phone buzzed once in his jacket pocket. He did not move immediately. He held his wife for another long moment. Then, when she turned to speak to Georgette, when Philippe stepped forward and wrapped both arms around them, Conrad reached into his jacket and glanced at the screen. Unknown number. No contact saved. "There is something about Sylvie she has never told you. About her health. About the year before your mother-in-law died and what Sylvie gave up to be there. Call me when you are ready to hear it." The ring on her finger caught the light as she laughed at something her sister said. She turned and looked back at Conrad over her shoulder, her eyes warm and steady and entirely real. He looked at the message, then he looked at her, then he closed the screen and slid the phone back into his pocket. He smiled. But behind his eyes, quiet and steady as the flicker of that cedar deck light in the Gatineau wind, something shifted. Equal parts certainty and unease, and the slow understanding that some stories, the ones that are real, the ones worth telling, do not end when the vows are spoken. They are only just beginning. 3 things emerge from Conrad's story that are true enough to name plainly, because they are too specific and too quiet to appear on any marriage seminar handout. The first, loneliness inside a marriage, has a face. It looks like a cup of coffee gone cold on a kitchen table at 6 in the morning, and the person who made it sitting in the dark, and the person who loves them walking right past without asking a single question. If you recognize that table, if you have sat at it or walked past it, do not wait for a crisis to say so. Tonight, before the television goes on, ask the person you share a life with one specific question. What is something you needed from me this year that I did not give you? Then listen without defending yourself. Just listen. That one question, asked honestly and received without deflection, has repaired more than most people realize. The second, sacrifice kept secret, becomes a weight. Sylvie's love was real and her choices were extraordinary, but carrying them alone for years cost her. If you have been quietly absorbing something for someone you love, a financial burden, an emotional load, a grief swallowed so they would not have to feel its weight, write it down this week. Not to give to them. For yourself. Name what you gave. Name what it cost. Because love that is never acknowledged, even privately, even only by the person who gave it, has a way of becoming something heavier than it started as. The third, the people worth watching are the ones who show up with nothing. Not the folder of documents, not the coffee from the right cafe. The ones who sit down, take your hand, and tell you who you are when you have forgotten. This story was written for those people. And if you are wondering about the message on that phone, about what Sylvie carried alone during the year her mother was dying, and what it cost her, and what Conrad does not yet know, come back. We will be here.